The story of Native American enslavement and their classification as Negroes reveals a history of forced labor, shifting identities, and colonial oppression that is often overshadowed by the transatlantic African slave trade. The enslavement of indigenous peoples in the Americas is a complex and devastating chapter that speaks to the deeply interconnected experiences of indigenous and African-descended peoples under colonial rule. As European colonizers arrived in the Americas, they encountered Native American societies with complex social, political, and economic structures. Driven by a desire to exploit the land and its resources, European settlers and their governments saw the Native American population as an exploitable labor force. Native American slavery began early in the colonial period, with Spanish conquistadors enslaving indigenous people as they advanced through the Caribbean, Central America, and South America. When Europeans first arrived in the Americas, they sought to establish systems of labor to support the extraction of natural resources and to cultivate plantations. From the outset, the Spanish, Portuguese, and later English settlers viewed Native American populations as a potential source of free labor. Native people were captured, taken from their lands, and often transported great distances, making it difficult to escape and return home. Europeans used a variety of tactics, from outright violence to manipulative treaties, to subjugate indigenous populations. Many Native Americans were forced into labor in mines, plantations, and other industries, creating a labor system that would shape much of the early economy of the colonies. However, Native American resistance to enslavement, along with high mortality rates due to diseases brought by Europeans, led colonizers to begin importing enslaved Africans to fill the labor gap. Even so, indigenous enslavement persisted in various forms for centuries, particularly in regions where native populations remained accessible and the demand for cheap labor continued. In the early colonial period, the racial classification of enslaved peoples was not as rigidly defined as it would later become. Native Americans who were captured and enslaved were often classified as Negroes or mulattoes, terms that were originally intended to refer to people of African descent. This classification was not merely a matter of semantics. It had real implications for the treatment, rights, and social standing of those labeled in this way. By categorizing indigenous people as Negroes, colonial authorities were able to justify their enslavement under the same laws that applied to enslaved Africans. In some cases, this classification was used to deny Native Americans their identity and cultural heritage, erasing their distinctions and contributing to a legal and social system that did not recognize indigenous identity. These misclassifications further demonstrate how racial categories were manipulated to serve the interests of colonial powers. By labeling indigenous people as Negroes, colonizers could legitimize the enslavement of native people within a system that was ostensibly based on race but was, in reality, deeply intertwined with power dynamics and economic motivations. The enslavement of Native Americans was not confined to one region but spanned the Americas, with notable differences in how it was practiced by Spanish, Portuguese, French, Dutch, and English settlers. In the early Spanish colonies, the encomienda system was established, whereby Spanish settlers were granted rights to indigenous labor in exchange for promises to protect and Christianize the indigenous population. However, this system was exploitative and led to the severe abuse of Native American workers. In North America, the English colonies also engaged in the enslavement of Native Americans, particularly in the Carolinas, where Native American slaves were captured through wars with neighboring tribes and then sold to planters in the Caribbean. Indigenous people in the Caribbean, including the Taino and Arawak, were some of the first to be enslaved by Europeans, with their labor used in the brutal sugar plantations that would become infamous for their extreme conditions and high mortality rates. The French and Dutch, while primarily focused on the fur trade, also enslaved Native Americans and trafficked them across the continent. European settlers faced resistance from Native Americans, who actively resisted enslavement and attempted to retain their autonomy. Resistance took many forms, from organized rebellions and warfare to subtle acts of defiance and escape. For example, the Yamasee War of 1715 was, in part, a response to the enslavement and exploitation of Native Americans by British settlers in the Carolinas. Additionally, Native Americans who were able to escape would often return to their tribes, and some were able to negotiate their release through alliances with other indigenous groups. However, the impact of European diseases on Native American populations made organized resistance difficult, as the diseases decimated entire communities, leaving survivors weakened and vulnerable to exploitation. The attempts of indigenous people to resist and assert their sovereignty highlight the resilience and agency of Native Americans, despite the enormous challenges posed by colonial oppression. One of the most insidious aspects of Native American enslavement was the way it contributed to the erasure of indigenous identities. The misclassification of indigenous people as Negroes or mulattoes stripped them of their heritage and social status, assimilating them into a racial category that colonial powers used to justify their enslavement. In many cases, this erasure was compounded by intermarriage between indigenous and African-descended people, further blurring racial lines and complicating the ability of indigenous people to maintain their cultural identity. Colonizers often viewed indigenous and African people as interchangeable labor sources, which led to the forced amalgamation of these communities. Over time, this fusion created unique Afro-Indigenous communities, whose members faced discrimination and marginalization under colonial and later American laws. This blending of identities and heritages resulted in a complex and often misunderstood social landscape where the descendants of enslaved indigenous people continue to fight for recognition and rights today. The legacy of indigenous enslavement has profound implications for contemporary indigenous and Afro-Indigenous communities. Many Native American tribes have historically struggled to gain federal recognition, a status that affords certain legal protections, social services, and land rights. The descendants of enslaved indigenous people, especially those who were classified as Negroes and assimilated into African American communities, often face difficulties in claiming Native ancestry and tribal membership. This issue is further complicated by the reluctance of some Native American tribes to acknowledge descendants who do not have clear and direct ties to their tribal communities due to the centuries of forced assimilation. Afro-Indigenous people, in particular, face a unique set of challenges as they navigate the intersection of Black and Native American identities. For some, this means reconciling their ancestry within a social framework that often fails to recognize the complexity of their heritage. These struggles are emblematic of the ways in which colonialism has left a lasting impact on Indigenous and Afro-Indigenous communities, both culturally and legally. The classification of enslaved Native Americans as Negroes and the denial of their heritage is a story of colonialism, racial exploitation, and resilience. This history sheds light on the interconnected oppression of Native Americans and African-descended people in the Americas, as well as the ways in which colonial systems of power manipulated racial categories to justify and perpetuate slavery. Understanding this history is essential to recognizing the complexities of racial identity in the Americas and to appreciating the unique struggles faced by Indigenous and Afro-Indigenous people. The erasure of Indigenous identities through the classification of enslaved Native Americans as Negroes represents a profound injustice that has had lasting repercussions. Today, there is a growing movement among Indigenous and Afro-Indigenous communities to reclaim and honor their heritage, challenging historical narratives that sought to erase their identities. By reclaiming their histories and identities, these communities are asserting their right to be recognized and respected within the broader tapestry of American society. The story of the first enslaved Native Americans and their classification as Negroes reveals a history that is both deeply painful and profoundly resilient. It is a reminder of the interconnected struggles of Indigenous and African-descended people and the importance of remembering the past to build a more just and inclusive future. Understanding this history not only honors the lives of those who were enslaved and erased, but also empowers future generations to continue the fight for justice and recognition.